though, Pamela. I know we're running behind schedule, but I had a great visitor report this afternoon, which has changed my day considerably, of a shark sighting in the middle of the woods. So a visitor had been hiking a trail and found half of a shark. I would say they figured it's about a foot, and yeah, I expect probably some eagle or something picked it up in the intertidal zone and drug it further into the woods. Some preliminary identification we figure maybe it's a blue shark, but anyway, not connected at all to what we're talking about today, but a weird and wacky stories that we get and observations that we get all the time. So anyway, I'm glad I was around the office today to get that observation, and now my afternoon is a hike in the woods to go search for a shark. So hello, and I'll get started now. That was just my side story.
That's great, Dan. Thanks for sharing.
So hello and bonjour, everyone. My name is Dan, and as I mentioned, I'm speaking today from Fundy National Park, which is located on unceded territory of Indigenous peoples who have lived on and cared for this land since time immemorial. And it's with great respect and gratitude that we need to acknowledge the integral role they have had and continue to have in preserving our special places across Canada. So Fundy National Park, some of you may have visited us before. We're located in the southern part of the province of New Brunswick along the shores of the Bay of Fundy. So maybe you visited us or are thinking of visiting us in the future. So maybe you've also visited other national parks in Canada as well. So Parks Canada is responsible for the protection, preservation, and presentation of 38 national parks, 10 national park reserves, 1 urban national park, and that's in addition to 171 historic sites and 4 national marine conservation areas. So these special places maintain the ecological and cultural health while still allowing us visitors to appreciate and connect with nature, with culture, and with our history. So today, I'm just introducing everybody. I get to sit in the background and think about sharks and salmon and everything. I'm going to introduce you, and the team is going to be introducing to the amazing work that's being done to restore and recover the endangered population of Inner Bay of Fundy Atlantic salmon. So I'm going to introduce the team that's with me today, and I thought hopefully I got them all. So Laura Clark is a field technician who works with our resource conservation team here in Fundy. John Whitelaw is our species at risk ecologist who also works with our resource conservation team. I've got Danielle Latendresse, who is our stewardship coordinator who works with a larger salmon recovery project. And then finally, we have Kurt Samways, who is affiliated with the Canadian Rivers Institute and University of New Brunswick St. John campus, and is also our Parks Canada research chair. And so for the presentation today, the team will be kind of bouncing back and forth and introducing you to the project. Our plan is probably similar to the other presentations today, is to kind of go through the presentation and then open it for questions after. And I'm sure Pamela and us will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. So if a question comes up, just pop it in the chat and we'll try to get to all the questions after the presentation. I see the slideshow is up. So I think the first is up is Laura. Is that correct? I'm going to pass it off to you, mute myself and hide myself and pass it off to Laura.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. So we'll go to the next slide. So we'll do a bit of an introduction on Atlantic salmon. This is true of any Atlantic salmon anywhere in North America, anywhere in Europe. But just to give you a bit of a background about the species. So salmon are androgynous. So they spend their young juvenile years in freshwater, and then they leave and go out to sea and spend their adult years in the saltwater. So they start off as little tiny eggs. They're about the size of a pea and they're nice buried in gravel, and they'll hatch in the spring. Then they'll grow into alevin, which are about 2 to 3 centimeters. And what makes them unique is they have a large yolk sac that gives them nutrients that they can use while they continue to live in the gravel and just get a little bit bigger. Then they'll grow into fry, and so they become fry when they emerge from the gravel. Their yolk sac can only sustain them for so long, so when it's almost empty, they'll come out of the gravel and they'll start to eat those invertebrates, those microorganisms, or those little bugs that are found in the water. And from there, they'll grow into parr. This is around the fall after they've hatched, and they have these really dark vertical stripes separated by a red dot. And they'll stay in the river for about 1 to 4 years. It really just depends on the food and the temperature of the water. And it's really up to the parr how long it stays. And each spring, depending on how long the parr has decided to stay in the river, it will start to become a smolt. So its scales will become really silver and they'll migrate downstream. And as they're leaving, they'll start to memorize the river, the different water chemistry, different features in the river, so that they can find their way back as adults to spawn. Next slide. So that's the freshwater phase. And then in the saltwater, so they leave in the spring. They're considered a grilse if they've spent 1 year out at sea. So this is about a 60-centimeter fish by this point. Once it starts to spend more than 1 winter out at sea, it's a multi-sea winter fish. So this is 2 or more. Typically, it'll come back after 3 if it intends to come back at all. And then when it's ready, when it matures, its color will start to change. It'll go from a silver and transition back into more of those brown scales to help them camouflage. Females will choose some fine gravel to dig their reds so that they can lay their eggs. And of course, males will fight over access to females while they spawn in the rivers. And this tends to happen in the fall. Next slide. So we work with Inner Bay of Fundy Atlantic salmon. So there's about 16 different populations of Atlantic salmon here in Canada. If you're from the Miramichi or the Restigouche, that would be the Gaspé and Gulf of St. Lawrence population. The Woolastook River, the Outer Bay of Fundy population. And what those two populations have in common is that those will migrate up to Greenland to spawn. So you can see this photo is tracking salmon leaving the Miramichi and kind of shows their journey over 1 to 2 years. So you can imagine Greenland is pretty far away, it's a pretty long journey. So they come back after 2 years. Next. We here in Fundy National Park work with the Inner Bay of Fundy Atlantic salmon. And what's special about this population is it really just sticks around the Bay of Fundy and the Gulf of Maine when it leaves and goes into the sea. So the Bay of Fundy is super rich with nutrients. And so the salmon really don't have to get far to get the nutrients that they need. And this is actually genetically distinct from all the other populations. Next slide.
Sorry. Yeah, so unfortunately, this population is extremely endangered. So it is the only Atlantic salmon population in Canada that is listed under the Species at Risk Act. So there are other populations that are currently being considered listed under the Species at Risk Act, but right now the Inner Bay of Fundy is the only population that is protected that way. And it is critically endangered, like I said. Historically, there was about 40,000 adults that were found across 45 rivers in the Inner Bay of Fundy. When we're talking about the Inner Bay, we're really talking about that top portion of the Bay of Fundy. There's about 45 rivers that had salmon, and now there's currently less than 200 wild individuals left. So it's pretty easy to see why they're so endangered. Most rivers are completely extirpated, meaning there's no salmon left in them at all. And it's really only a handful of rivers that still have salmon remaining in them. Why are they so endangered? Right now, marine survival appears to be the most limiting factor or the most limiting cause of recovery. Right now, there's less than 1% survival in the marine phase. So as Laura just mentioned, those smolts that leave the river to grow into adults to come back, less than 1% of them actually survive and come back. And that's host to reason, you know, there's a whole host of factors and reasons why that could be. There's been a lot of efforts to recover this population, and there's a program called the Live Gene Bank, similar to what you just heard with the trees. Instead of putting seeds, we're putting actual fish, and so they're housed at a few federal hatchery facilities, one in New Brunswick and one in Nova Scotia, and they've maintained those genetic populations, so the population hasn't gone completely extinct. Unfortunately, it hasn't recovered them, and this population is still critically low. One of the problems is that this population now really doesn't have a mechanism to bounce back on their own. And we've done some research and calculations, you know, on the salmon, and it would take about 200 years for this population to return all on its own. And that's assuming that the survival rates are stayed the same and they're able to reproduce at the same rates. That's notwithstanding any other changes from, you know, climate change or any other human-induced factors. So you can see that without people doing something, this population would go extinct. Next slide, please. So you know why we can't forget about the things that we have done as humans over the last 2.5 centuries. So virtually every river in the inner Bay of Fundy had a dam on them, and they were primarily used for driving logs. And you know, this isn't to the fault of anyone. We didn't know any better. We needed to get lumber. We needed to get those logs down, and driving them down the river was the easiest way. But you can see from these pictures just how many logs, you know, were in a river. And these are historic pictures from Fundy National Park. And so you can imagine what that's doing to the river. But also the dam, like on the bottom left there, that used to be the old Point Wolf lumber mill, and it was a complete barrier, so no salmon could actually enter the river at all. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So one of the things that, you know, we're trying to do is we want fish to be as wild as possible, and the wild, you know, the more wild the better. And so the reason being is that the less active exposure, less time salmon are held in captivity, the better they do in the wild, the better survival they have. Next slide, please. So if we compare the two environments, so a wild environment versus kind of an artificial hatchery environment, you can see right off the bat, you know, from a salmon's perspective, what might be a more suitable or a favorable environment. Next slide, please. So if we can, you know, compare the two, you know, the wild environment has, you know, these, you know, there's a lot of habitat complexity. There's a lot of places for salmon to hide. Typically, the densities are lower, so there's fewer individuals per unit area. And in the wild, naturally, lots of salmon will die. And so there's a lot of mortality associated through this life cycle. If we compare that to an artificial hatchery environment, I always equate it to, you know, being in a toilet. The water's just swirling around, going down the center. So there's really nothing there for salmon to hide in. And you can see in the picture, they're all kind of, most of them are huddled around the one little piece of equipment that's sticking in, that's giving them a little bit of cover. We can grow them in really high densities, and we can have extremely high survival because we're protecting them from all the dangers, you know, that are out there. Next slide, please.
So then if you start to think of the wild environment versus the artificial environment and kind of the salmon's connection to that spot. So in the same way, I'm sure that most of you're pretty connected to your communities where you grew up and your surrounding areas where you spent time through the people, your friends and family, and the landmarks. If there's certain buildings where you played sports or you went out into nature, it's the same for salmon. Salmon also have those connections. And so by maximizing the time that salmon, both young salmon and older adult salmon, can spend in the wild, helps to restore these connections that they don't otherwise get in the hatcheries. So thinking about their interactions with other salmon that are both younger and older than them, other aquatic species. We have brook trout and dace as well, and American eels, which Kurt kindly nicknames river puppies because they look like little puppies, little food sources, microorganisms. So in a healthy river system, the emergence of all these little bugs in the spring actually coincides with the hatching of the fry, so that when the fry want to eat something, there's something that is an appropriate size for them to eat. Predators, they have to learn to evade predators, which yes, also includes humans because we do eat them. Water composition, they learn to recognize the water composition in their streams where they're born so that they can go back and find it. And same thing with the geographical river features, different types of habitat, riffle, runs, pools, where all of those are located, because those are all beneficial at some point or another. And I could probably talk for a while, but I think we can move to the next slide. And so unfortunately, a member of our Indigenous relations team was unable to be here today, but they have provided a little bit of text that I will read from them that they have provided. So in Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge, the Mi'kmaq way of life, it's the result of centuries of interaction, observation, and adaptation to the natural environment. It is this science of Mi'kmaq survival, interwoven with spirituality and culture, that is unique to these people. We see the world and everything in it as having a spirit. We consider all life to be equal to our own and treat it with respect. The Mi'kmaq have developed an intimate understanding of the relationship between the living and the non-living, so that every plant, animal, constellation, full moon, or red sky tells a story that guides people to survive in their environment. The salmon, or in fact all animals and plants, are not taken if it's not necessary, and this means catching or harvesting just enough to feed the community. No part of an animal is wasted, and any parts that cannot be used are returned to the creator. If the salmon population is deemed too low, the Mi'kmaq will fish for other species and allow the salmon population to recover. This is the Mi'kmaq concept of conservation, and it's why salmon have thrived under their care for millennia. Next slide, please. So we work a lot with Fort Folly First Nation. So Balamu, meaning salmon, is a very important species to Mi'kmaq and Fort Folly. In the heart of their traditional territory, the Petitcodiac River, it was once home to about 20% of the total Inner Bay of Fundy population. So back when we started our program in the early 2000s, members of Fort Folly were right there beside us in our early recovery efforts. And then with the causeway, which was built in 1968, they announced that in 2010 that they were going to start opening the gates. And Fort Folly was really confident in taking a role in recovery efforts on the Petitcodiac River. So after years of dedication to the species, and they do a lot of habitat recovery, they've built a lot of technical capacity and strong partnerships, they play a strong role in the Fundy salmon recovery, and they've been a cornerstone to restoring the ecosystem in the Petitcodiac. So you can see here below too, in just the ecological changes of the causeway. Here's a photo, it's in 1954 of the Petitcodiac River before the causeway was built. And then you can see, I think this is 1999, kind of how dramatic the changes have been since they put in the causeway. So by opening the causeway, that fish were now able to migrate upstream. And so they were able to work on the Little River and the Paulet River in the Petitcodiac watershed in hopes of helping us to restore the species, by kind of improving that habitat. Next slide.
So, up to this point, we've really been talking about salmon and how important they are. And they're extremely important, but we can't forget about the whole ecosystem, because salmon are just one component of the ecosystem. Having said that, though, they're a very key species for any aquatic or riverine ecosystem. And the reason for this is they play many key roles. So, as Laura mentioned earlier, salmon, they leave the river as a smolt, and they're spending 1 to 2 to 3 years in the ocean. And while they're in the ocean, of course, they're feeding and they're growing, and they're acquiring all kinds of energy and nutrients as they feed. And so when they come back to spawn, when they come back to the river to spawn, they actually release those nutrients. And so, they're sitting in the river, they're spending, months, many months, up to 6 months in a river before they spawn. And the whole time they're releasing nutrients, right? They're excreting feces. And then when they spawn, they're releasing all those eggs. So you can imagine all those eggs, those are all nutrients, right? They're nitrogen and phosphorus and carbon, just like you would be fertilizing a field. And so those nutrients are then taken up into the food web. And so if you see this kind of little progression I have on the slide there, so those dissolved nutrients are taken up by the algae, that's the stuff, the slimy stuff that we all slip on when we're walking in a river. That's all food for bugs. And so the more fish, the more salmon there are, there's more nutrients, more algae, then there's more food for bugs. If there's more food for bugs, we can have more bugs and they grow bigger, and then that becomes the food for salmon and brook trout and other fish species. And so, we really need salmon to come back in order to have a healthy ecosystem, because when we don't have salmon, the ecosystem isn't as healthy. It may look healthy, right? We see some of these rivers, they're clean, they're pristine, we think they're absolutely beautiful, and they are, but from a productivity or a functioning standpoint, they're not working the way they should. They're not working at their maximum capacity because they don't have all the energy to drive what's needed for those ecosystems to function. And those nutrients translate into meaningful results for salmon. So, on the bottom there, you can see there's just a couple figures. When juvenile salmon, those fry and those par are in rivers where adults are spawning, they grow bigger than if we were just to put some baby salmon in the river. So they grow longer. So they can grow 3 centimeters longer and almost 5 grams heavier. It's because there's more nutrients in the ecosystem, there's more food for them, and so they can grow bigger and faster. Next slide, please. So, quite often we'll give salmon the term ecosystem engineers. And I think many of you are probably familiar with this idea of ecosystem engineers. We've all, we know beavers, and we know, the dams and the lodges that beavers build and how they can change forest habitat from small streams flowing through, and they dam them up and they form wetlands. So they're changing the ecosystem. Atlantic salmon do the same thing, only in a different way. They're not building dams and changing the ecosystem, but they're bringing those nutrients back that drive all life in the river. And so this is, I think, a good example of what I'm talking about. So on the top, these are just some bugs that I collected from a river that had salmon. And on the bottom, it's the same. We did the same method, same collection, same area, same time. And you can see just how few bugs there really were. And that's because, again, those salmon are bringing back all those nutrients and allows for more bugs and more food for the next generation of salmon. So they're not only engineering the river for other species, they're engineering the river so that they can have more babies, more offspring. And so next time you're out in the river, just flip over a rock. It's something I do all the time. And as Laura and everyone else can attest, I probably do it too often, and I should be getting back to work, as Laura likes to say. But I'm fascinated with all the bugs that are there and what's under there. So just pick up a rock and you'll see all the little bugs crawling around. That's all important for having that next generation of salmon. Next slide, please. So we've been doing a lot of work in Fundy National Park, and as Laura mentioned, our partners at Fort Folly, they're working in the Petitcodiac system. But these are just two small rivers, and when we think of Atlantic salmon, we need to take a step back and look at this map. And pretty well all of Atlantic Canada had salmon at one point, and so there's this idea of doing conservation at scale, and really what that means is working at a scale that's appropriate to the population that's of interest. And we can work at our own little inner Bay of Fundy population, and that's important for those local rivers. But if we think of Atlantic salmon as a whole, it's declining pretty well across all of Atlantic Canada. And so if we start looking at this population from a bigger lens, or if we take a step back and look at it from a wide angle, we can start to see things that we just wouldn't be able to see when we look at it in our own little backyard. And so there's a big project with Parks Canada. It's a 5-park, multi-park project. So it's Fundy National Park, Kujawakak, so both of those are in New Brunswick. We have Cape Breton Highlands in Nova Scotia, Grossmorn and Terra Nova in Newfoundland. And the idea is to start looking at salmon and salmon conservation and the role they play in the ecosystem on a large regional scale, and try to understand this population at its kind of evolutionary scale instead of just what's happening in our river. And so by putting those two scales together, the small and the large, we can really start to understand how best to try and help these imperiled populations. Next slide, please.
So as you can see by the numerous photos, there are so many different sections of conservation. I think often we kind of just look at the infield, you're collecting data, you're in the river, and that's really the only section. But through our numerous partners, there's actually so much more to protecting an endangered species. So you can see here, this is Mactaquac Biodiversity Facility. We do a lot of work with them in more of a hatchery environment. There is that in-river component. Here we're actually swimming to see adult salmon. So we swim kind of once a month. We swim sections of our rivers just to see how many adults are there and look for any external tags, male, female, just to see how many of them are actually around and if any of them are returning salmon. Communicating conservation is also a very critical point. If you've heard our story about our returning salmon in the news, it required a media person. Danielle, our stewardship coordinator, put in a lot of work to get those success stories out there, and also doing presentations like Kurt and I are doing for you today. Kind of the data and analyst side, to kind of collect all the results that we're seeing and go through to see where those changes are happening. We have an endangered species, so law enforcement is required to protect them. And as salmon cross many jurisdictional boundaries, not only park wardens, but also working with DFO conservation officers, Environment Canada, RCMP, Crime Stoppers, all of those do play a part in conserving a species. Of course, our Indigenous partners with Fort Folly First Nation and other Indigenous groups around Atlantic Canada. We work with industry, so here's Cook Aquaculture, which helps us to do a bit more of the controlled wild exposure on the marine front, so that wouldn't be possible without industry partners. And next slide. So if you can kind of think about your skills and what you're looking to get into, it doesn't always have to be the science side, but there are so many different areas of conservation. Where could you see yourself working in conservation? Is it more science? Is it more media? Is it more law enforcement? So there's many different areas that you can work in with doing conservation, and it doesn't have to be salmon. There are many different species. And next slide. So obviously we work with a great number of partners. It certainly takes a village to recover a species. We cannot do it on our own. So working with Mactaquac Biodiversity Facility and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, through Cook Aquaculture, the village of Greenland, and the government of New Brunswick, we are able to have our first wild marine conservation site. ACFA does a lot of communications between us and industry and helps keep us all on track. Parks Canada, of course, us and our multi-park program. The University of New Brunswick, certainly working with Dr. Kurt Samways and our Parks Canada Research Chair, doing a lot of research. And of course, Fort Folly First Nation in kind of their work on the Petitcodiac and their Indigenous knowledge throughout. Thank you very much. And with that, I will open the floor for questions.
Thank you. I have a thank you to Daniel behind the scenes, Laura, John, Danielle, and Kirk. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I had the privilege